How much Supersport do you really need for Alpine roads? We're here with Yamaha's R7 and R9 to find out which one offers the better package for tight corners and wider country roads here in Switzerland. Stay tuned! A very warm welcome, or grüezi, from beautiful Switzerland. Today we've got two gorgeous machines from Yamaha, and we're in exactly the kind of place where these sports bikes can really come into their own and stretch their legs a little. We've got the Yamaha R7 here in this beautiful anniversary white with its red and white color scheme. I think it looks absolutely fantastic. And over here we have the R9 in the standard Yamaha blue we all know. Today we want to find out whether the R7 is enough for country roads and Alpine roads in particular, or whether it's worth stepping up to the R9. Before we get into our own riding impressions though, I think it would be useful to quickly run through the technical basics of both motorcycles. Gregor, I think that's your cue. You're really good at this stuff. Want to help me out?
You're really setting me up there. Quite a lot has actually changed for 2026 on both bikes, although the R9 is still a relatively new model. It's based around the 890 cubic centimeters inline 3 engine that we know, for example, from the Tracer 9 and MT-09. It was announced for 2025, but then there were some delivery issues. So I think 2026 is really the year when we can say the R9 has properly arrived on the market. The R7, on the other hand, has been around for longer, but it has undergone something of a transformation over the years. For 2026, it's more similar than ever to the R9, and I'd say to its even bigger Supersport sister, the R1. Why? What do I mean by that? The R7 has become more radical in the sense that it has become more of a genuine Supersport. For the first time, for example, it now gets the 6-axis IMU from the R1, just like the R9. For the first time, it also gets this nice new 5-inch TFT display where you can have things like track layouts just like on the R9. It now has an 830mm seat height, which is only 5mm lower than the R9, so you can already see a few parallels. At their core, though, they still have very different engines. The R7 uses the CP2, producing 73.4 horsepower at 8,750 revolutions per minute. The R9, meanwhile, produces 119 horsepower at 10,000 revolutions per minute from its inline 3 and a maximum of 93 Newton meters of torque at 7,000 revolutions per minute. The R7 uses a steel diamond frame. What else is different? Both bikes have Kayaba suspension, but here on the R7, we have a 41mm upside-down fork compared with a 43mm upside-down fork on the R9. So the R9 gets slightly higher spec equipment. Both are adjustable, but the R9, for example, also offers separate high and low speed adjustment. The R9 also gets the higher spec braking hardware, Brembo brakes with twin 320mm discs at the front. The R7 doesn't get Brembo hardware, and if I remember correctly, it has 296mm discs at the front. Then there's the electronics. I already mentioned the IMU, and that brings a lot of functionality with it. Various lean angle sensitive assistance systems, traction control, ABS with different levels and modes, different riding modes, lift control and slide control. So the R7 is now really well equipped electronically too. And that brings me to the final point. The 3rd generation quickshifter is now fitted to both bikes. Both have the same 14-litre fuel tank, and overall there's only a 6-kilogram difference in ready-to-ride weight. A quick word about the wheels. Identical dimensions on both bikes, although they don't have the same tyres. The R7 now comes standard with Bridgestone S23 tyres, which are seriously good tyres. The R9 would normally come with Bridgestone RS11 tyres, but our bike here is running Pirelli Diablo Rosso 4 Corsa tyres, so proper sporty rubber. Put all of that together, including the identical 14-litre tanks, and we end up with 195 kilograms ready to ride for the R9 and 189 kilograms for the R7. Maybe we should move on to the riding impressions.
Especially with motorcycles that are actually so close to each other, it's important to identify those small differences and show what they mean. And I think that's really the key point behind our impressions. On paper, they look very similar, but once you ride them, you realize there are still some clear differences.
Exactly. Spotting those small differences is even more important when you're actually riding than it is when you're looking at the spec sheet. We've had some really varied roads here today around Entlebuch and the surrounding Alps. The conditions are constantly changing, from bumpy, broken up surfaces to really smooth asphalt, from wide roads to narrow roads, from blind corners to open visible bends. That demands quite a lot from both the motorcycle and the rider because there's so much variety, and these motorcycles are obviously designed primarily for sporty riding. But there are plenty of people who buy Supersport bikes because they look great, sound great, and are simply cool, and then actually use them for trips like this. So we haven't just invented this use case out of nowhere. We even saw an R9 coming the other way earlier today. So we're not the only crazy people riding Supersports over mountain passes. So where are the differences? The most obvious one from the spec sheet is obviously the power. There's roughly a 45 horsepower difference between these two bikes. And yet we actually tested it and tried to measure the difference. And within the speed range that matters on public roads, there basically wasn't one. We did a roll-on acceleration test. Here in Switzerland, the speed limit is 80 kilometers per hour. So we measured acceleration from 30 to 80 kilometers per hour. I'd say that's a fairly typical speed window when you come out of a corner and open the throttle a little. And we did the whole thing in second gear, so already a relatively low gear. You might think that gives the inline 3 a chance to build some revs and show us its potential, and yet what was the result?
Basically, you couldn't notice any difference. And I think when you mentioned the power figures earlier, you said the R9 makes its peak power at 10,000 revolutions per minute. And its maximum torque is somewhere around 8,700 revolutions per minute. And that really tells you something. To actually exploit that additional performance, you pretty much have to be traveling at speeds that aren't legal on public roads. Compared with the R7, where maximum torque arrives at 6,500 revolutions per minute, and you notice that it just gets up and goes. If we done the test from 30 to 150 kilometers per hour, the R9 obviously would have pulled away. But here on these Alpine roads and basically anywhere outside a racetrack, you're rarely going to reach those kinds of speeds. At least we hope not, because here you might end up in prison.
I'm certainly not going to risk riding that far over the speed limit in Switzerland, but of course it's not only about outright power, the engine character changes as well. Here we have an inline twin. Generally speaking, fewer cylinders mean a more torque-focused character. So it's not surprising that the R7 feels more focused on that low and mid-range torque. At the same time, imagine you're a huge superbike fan. Maybe you grew up with Supersport posters on your bedroom wall, or perhaps you have experience riding proper old-school Supersports, inline 4s, Japanese bikes, and so on. There were some fantastic machines, especially in the 1990s. If that's where you're coming from, you probably don't necessarily want an inline twin in your Supersport. In that case, you're more likely to choose the R9 because it changes the whole experience. It simply feels different. You get more of that screaming engine note. Even when you're leaned over further in a corner, it feels lighter and smoother when you start applying throttle at the apex. And there's something special about revving out those very flexible gears with the inline 3. The inline twin doesn't give you that same experience. Objectively though, on very tight roads, I think the twin is simply more practical. It asks less of you. You can just cruise along easily and always have that punch of torque ready to fire you out of the corner. You don't have to be quite as precise or deliberate with the throttle.
Although we were talking about this earlier as well, with more cylinders, the assistance systems can intervene more smoothly and efficiently. If you are spending a long time riding Alpine roads and safety is still important to you, then obviously the difference is marginal, but the 3-cylinder engine has an advantage there too. And I think the quickshifter also plays into the character of that inline 3. You notice a difference there too. The quickshifter on the R7 is by no means bad, but on the R9 it simply feels crisper, faster, and in my opinion smoother. I think we can safely say that. The R9 is the clear winner in that respect. I want to briefly touch on another subject. We've talked about the long sweeping corners you get on Alpine roads, but as you said, Switzerland also has these narrower roads with plenty of bumps. What did you notice when switching from one motorcycle to the other? What stood out most?
There's definitely a difference, although it's not that easy to pinpoint exactly what causes it. The R7 felt significantly more agile to me, especially on narrow roads where you often have one direction change immediately after another, winding continuously along the mountainside, often with a bumpy surface as well. The R7 seemed to turn in more quickly and required less input, less body movement, and less effort to push it into the corner. You can basically counter-steer and push both motorcycles. We both tend to ride like that because we come from enduros and supersports aren't really our primary type of motorcycle, but I think it feels more natural to use your body to pull these bikes into the corner. However you ride them, the thing I noticed was that the R7 was more agile. It was easier to lean over and, above all, quicker to flick from one side to the other. The suspension also felt a little more forgiving. You could say the bike was less harsh and less sensitive to bigger bumps. It absorbed them more willingly. It's probably simply set up a little more comfortably in its current configuration. As I said, both bikes are adjustable. We deliberately didn't spend a lot of time experimenting with the settings today, and realistically, we didn't have the time either. Especially with high-quality suspension offering high and low-speed adjustment, finding the right setup can become a bit of a science. So we're definitely not saying that it's impossible to find the perfect Alpine setup for either the R7 or the R9, but as the bikes were set up today, the R7 was slightly more comfortable and slightly softer, which worked well on the bumpy roads. And it was also slightly more agile. Why is that? We talked about it and looked at the figures. The R7 has a 25mm shorter wheelbase. Is that enough on its own? I don't know. It weighs 6 kilograms less. Is that enough on its own? Again, I don't know. Then there are the tires, which are another difference. The Bridgestone S23 is a very agile, willing road tire. Meanwhile, the Pirelli Diablo Rosso 4 Corsa is a serious sports tire. It's less focused on agility and more on high grip, and it also needs more temperature to really work properly. Is that alone enough to explain it? We don't know. It's probably the combination of all these small differences that ultimately creates a noticeable difference in agility. Small differences, big effect. For me, the tighter the road became, the more I preferred being on the R7, and perhaps that's also combined with the difference in engine character we already described, the way the performance is delivered. That accessible torque simply makes things easier on extremely tight roads. Frankie, I'll throw the ball back to you. When the roads became wider, did you feel you could make better use of the R9's potential?
Definitely not, because when it comes to supersports, I'm basically a beginner. Definitely not, because when it comes to supersports, I'm basically a beginner. Well, maybe not an absolute beginner. But these bikes have so much potential that it's difficult to fully exploit them on Alpine roads or in public traffic anyway. But one thing I really like about the R9 is its stability. It's a bit like a train on rails. And that also gives you confidence. The downside, as you said, is that you lose some agility. I also feel you have to work much harder with your body to get the motorcycle to do exactly what you want. Obviously, there are riders with much more experience and better technique. But if you simply think these motorcycles are cool and you don't have that much experience yet, the lack of agility can make things more demanding. On the other hand, you feel secure and stable. And when you reach one of those long sweeping corners, you not only have the extra power, which eventually really starts to come alive, but you also get that feeling of being completely planted, almost like you're running on rails. That's something the R9 does really well. Again, we're running different tires here. Tires make an enormous difference, especially on motorcycles like these, and you can't ignore that. But the overall impression is coherent, and it reflects what this motorcycle wants to do. It wants long sweeping corners, it wants the racetrack, it wants to review. And I still think it's important to say that we're not trying to talk the R9 down here. You can feel that DNA when you ride it. Maybe not so much in extremely tight corners, but as soon as you get into more conventional bends like the ones up here on the Glaubenberg Pass, you can feel that DNA.
I also think the inline 3 character we described earlier works beautifully with the R9's greater stability. It just creates such a great feeling. We haven't actually talked about ergonomics yet, but I'd say the ergonomics are identical or almost identical. Both have clip-on handlebars. The foot peg position is also very similar, perhaps minimally different. And you can see holes here in the frame that allow you to reposition the pegs. It's all very Supersport-like and well executed on both motorcycles. On both bikes, I also like how you can hook your knees nicely into these well-sculpted fuel tanks. I'm 1.85 meters. It works. Of course, because I come from enduros, I probably look like a monkey on a grindstone on any Supersport. Of course, the riding position is tight, but it's a Supersport. If you want a relaxed knee angle, you're riding the wrong type of motorcycle. I'd say it worked fine. And when hanging off, at least as well as I know how to do it, I found both bikes pretty good. But then you're at full lean through a longer corner, feeling the R9's stability, and you start feeding in that silky smooth 3-cylinder power at the apex, load it up, and then fire yourself out of the corner a little. Unfortunately, because of the speed limits, you have to roll off far too soon. But maybe you can cheekily bang it up another gear, and that quickshifter works so brilliantly. It really is a fantastic riding experience on the R9. But as you correctly said, it's slightly more demanding here on Alpine roads than the R7. The R7 simply makes life a little easier. I think it really depends on whether you already know that Supersports are your thing and that they'll continue to be your thing in the future. If so, take the R9. It gets about as close to a classic Supersport as you can, while still offering a really good package for public road riding thanks to the 3-cylinder engine and everything else we've described. The R7, on the other hand, is a very good motorcycle for getting your first taste of the Supersport world. And it isn't some watered-down Supersport. There are motorcycles that look like Supersports but then have conventional handlebars and are more comfortable on the road. And ultimately, you don't really get the authentic Supersport experience in terms of ergonomics, handling, and riding dynamics. With the R7, you do. You get the ergonomics, you get the assistance systems inherited from the R1. There's already a lot of genuine Supersport DNA in this bike. The engine is probably the biggest area where it differs, but if this is your first motorcycle or you're thinking about buying one, the R7 gives you a really good opportunity to find out whether Supersports are actually right for you, and then perhaps a few years later you might decide, okay, now I want to go all in. Then you buy an R9, an R1, or something else. I'd say that's one of the biggest differences between them. It depends on where you are in your journey as a rider. And I think that brings us to the end. Leave us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and if you want to show some appreciation for the work we put into it and for beautiful Switzerland. Frankie, thanks for bringing us along. And leave us a comment with your thoughts on these two bikes. Which one would you choose, the R9 or the R7? Thank you, Frankie, for inviting me on this beautiful trip today. See you on the next one. Ciao.